There is a moment in every conflict, every real conflict, not the sanitized version you read about in history books, when the enemy makes a mistake so catastrophic, so fundamentally revealing of their desperation that the entire strategic landscape shifts in a single night. We are living in one of those moments right now. And if you think you understand what just happened over the skies of Moscow, I promise you, you don't. Not yet. Stay with me, because by the time we're done here, you will see this war with completely different eyes. Let me take you back to Saturday night. While most of the world was asleep, Ukraine launched what may be the single most consequential military operation of this entire conflict. Not because of the destruction it caused, though the destruction was significant. Not because of the headlines it generated, though those headlines will echo for weeks. No, what happened Saturday night matters because of what it revealed about Russia's vulnerabilities, about Ukraine's capabilities, and about the fundamental nature of will, courage, and strategic patience in modern warfare. 586 drones. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Russian authorities claim they shot down 586 Ukrainian drones in a single night. And here's what every military commander knows that the public often misses. When your enemy tells you how many projectiles they intercepted, they are simultaneously confessing how many got through. Russia didn't say the last part. They never do. But the burning runway at Sheremetyevo Airport, the busiest aviation hub in the country, said it for them. The exploding oil refinery in the southeast of Moscow said it. The semiconductor plant producing microelectronics for Russia's high-precision weapons, struck at the Elma Technopark in Zelenograd, said it loudly and clearly. 186 strikes, 46 targets, occupied territories, Crimea, and Russia itself, all in a single operational window. This was not a raid. This was a statement. Now I want you to think like a commander for a moment, because this is where most analysts get it wrong. They look at the physical damage and they calculate the cost-benefit ratio of munitions expended versus infrastructure destroyed. That's one layer of analysis, and it's valid, but it's the surface layer. The deeper strategic logic of what Ukraine did Saturday night operates on a completely different frequency, the frequency of psychology, perception, and political will. President Zelensky made a comment that I want you to remember. He said, "The concentration of Russian air defense in the Moscow region is the highest, but we are overcoming it." Read that again. He wasn't boasting about the strike itself. He was delivering a message with two edges sharp enough to cut through steel. First, even your most protected city is not safe. Second, every air defense system you move to protect Moscow is a system that is no longer protecting your front lines, your logistics corridors, your ammunition depots. Ukraine just handed itself an invitation to strike everywhere else Russia thought it was hiding. That is not a tactical observation. That is a strategic masterstroke. But there's something else happening here that most people are missing entirely. And what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about how this war is actually being fought. I've spent decades in special operations. I've planned missions at every level of complexity, from small unit raids to multinational coalition operations. And one of the first things you learn, one of the foundational truths of military leadership, is that the psychological dimension of warfare is not secondary to the physical dimension. It is the primary dimension. Napoleon understood it. Sun Tzu understood it 3,000 years before Napoleon. And Ukraine, in the years since the full-scale invasion began, has learned it in the most brutal possible classroom, the battlefield itself. When Commander Robert Brovdy of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces posted an image of a drone with the words, "Moscow never sleeps," written across its wing, and then specifically called out the Patriarch's Ponds neighborhood, one of the most elite, most insulated districts in the entire Russian capital, he wasn't being theatrical. He was being precise. He was sending a message directly to the people who matter most in Russia's decision-making ecosystem: the oligarchs, the generals, the bureaucrats, the families of the powerful who have spent 3 years watching this war on television as if it were happening on another planet. He was telling them, your planet just changed its address. That matters more than the tonnage of ordnance dropped, because wars ultimately are not won by armies. They are won or lost in the minds of the people who fund those armies, supply those armies, and decide whether those armies continue to fight. And right on cue, right in the wake of those strikes, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov appeared before cameras and suggested that Moscow might be willing to restart dialogue with Brussels. Think about the timing. Think about what that tells you. For months, the Kremlin has positioned itself as the immovable object, the party with no urgency to negotiate, the power that time and attrition were serving. And then, the morning after Ukraine's largest drone attack in over a year, the Kremlin is suddenly talking about opening channels of communication. That is not a coincidence. That is cause and effect. That is what happens when the war comes home. Now, I don't want you to mistake this for victory. I've been in enough operational theaters to know that one brilliant night of strikes does not end the war. Russia launched 524 drones and 22 missiles against Ukraine the very next night. Residential buildings in Odessa were hit. The city of Dnipro endured 6 hours of explosions. The enemy is still hitting back, and hitting hard. This is not a moment for celebration. It is a moment for clear-eyed assessment. But here is what I need you to understand about resilience, about the kind of deep structural resilience that determines the outcome of long wars. Kyiv hosted a marathon on Sunday. An air raid alert sounded during the race. The runners did not stop. Read that sentence one more time. An air raid alert sounded, and the runners did not stop. That is not stubbornness. That is not recklessness. That is a civilization that has made a decision about who it is and what it will not surrender. I have stood beside some of the finest warriors this country has ever produced, and I will tell you without hesitation, that kind of will is a force multiplier that no missile can destroy. And yet, even as Ukraine demonstrates that will on the streets of its capital, it is simultaneously grappling with one of the most complex and politically sensitive challenges of this entire war, one that will determine not just the next battle, but the outcome of the conflict itself. 30,000 new soldiers enter Ukraine's armed forces every month. The question being asked at the highest levels of government by the most serious military minds in the country is whether that number is enough. And the answer, the honest, uncomfortable, strategically critical answer, is not simple. General Kirilo Budanov, now head of the president's office, and the man who ran Ukrainian military intelligence through some of the darkest chapters of this war, has said publicly what every commander already knows privately. Voluntary recruitment alone cannot generate the numbers the Army requires. Not at this stage. Not after 12 and a half years of conflict, counting from 2014. Not after 4 years of full-scale, grinding, industrial-scale warfare. He is not wrong. And the conversation about how Ukraine solves that problem, how it sustains its fighting force without breaking its society, is one of the most important conversations happening in Kyiv right now. Here is what I want you to hold on to as we go deeper into this. The hardest leadership challenges are never the ones that have obvious answers. They are the ones where every available option carries a real cost, where the people making the decisions understand that no choice is clean, no path is without sacrifice. That is the situation Ukraine's leadership is navigating right now, and what they are building, the recruitment architecture, the reform packages, the contract structures, the decentralized brigade-level branding campaigns, is something that has never been built in the middle of a war of this scale before. But if you think the recruitment crisis is the most complicated problem on Ukraine's plate right now, you're not ready for what's coming. Because simultaneously, across the Black Sea and in the skies over Europe, a set of developments is unfolding that will reshape the strategic architecture of this entire conflict. And it starts with a Russian drone hitting a Chinese cargo ship the night before Vladimir Putin boarded a plane to Beijing. Think about what that means. Think about the diplomatic geometry of that moment. Russia's most important strategic partner, the relationship Moscow has cultivated as its lifeline against Western sanctions and isolation, and a Russian drone struck a Chinese vessel in Ukrainian territorial waters. One day before Putin sat down with Xi Jinping, the Ukrainian Navy spokesperson put it with the kind of dry precision that only people who deal in hard truths can manage. This is something new. The Russian military, whether through error or indifference, just handed Ukraine a propaganda victory and Beijing a grievance in a single munition. And that tells you something critical about the state of Russian operational discipline and strategic coordination at this stage of the war. And the reverberations of that single moment, a burning cargo ship, a diplomatic visit, a partnership under strain, connect directly to everything happening in Europe right now, where the continent is engaged in the most significant rearmament effort since the Second World War. Germany alone is spending at a scale that would have been politically unthinkable 3 years ago. €500 billion for infrastructure, a recruitment drive targeting 60,000 new soldiers for the Bundeswehr, Heckler and Koch running double shifts on factory floors, expanding production facilities, acquiring businesses in the UK, racing to arm a continent that spent 3 decades believing it would never need to arm itself again. I've seen what happens to nations that allow their defenses to atrophy. I've seen what happens when a military is chronically underfunded, when its equipment is aging, when its soldiers are undertrained, and when its political leadership convinces itself that the post-Cold War peace dividend is permanent. The bill always comes due. It always arrives without warning and always demands more than you can comfortably pay. Europe is paying that bill right now, and the question that keeps serious defense planners awake at 3 in the morning is whether they are paying it fast enough. Because here is the other dimension of this story, the one that cuts beneath the headline figures and the factory tours and the government press releases. The Tomahawk missiles that the Biden administration pledged to station in Germany, long-range, ground-launched fire capability that would have filled a genuine Achilles heel in NATO's conventional deterrence, are not coming. The Trump administration buried that commitment in a diplomatic firestorm triggered when German Chancellor Friedrich Merz described American negotiating performance in the Iran talks as humiliating. 5,000 troops withdrawn, the Tomahawk pledge revoked, and Europe suddenly staring at a capability gap that it does not know how to fill on a timeline that matters. Let me tell you something about capability gaps. In special operations, we have a saying: the gap between what you have and what you need is not a planning problem. It is a leadership problem. Because every gap that exists in your order of battle existed yesterday, and the day before, and the year before that. Someone chose not to fill it. Someone decided that the risk was acceptable, that the threat was manageable, that the budget cycle could absorb another delay. And then one day, the gap is no longer theoretical. It is operational. It is the moment when the mission launches and the asset you needed is not there. And the consequences of that absence are measured not in dollars or political capital, but in lives. Europe is staring at that moment right now. And the conversation happening in Berlin, in Paris, in Warsaw, in the Baltic capitals is not an abstract defense policy debate. It is an urgent, visceral reckoning with the possibility that the security architecture that has protected the continent for 80 years is fracturing, and that no cavalry is coming to ride to the rescue this time. The European Long-Range Strike Approach, ELSA, is the answer that European defense planners are reaching for. A homegrown cruise missile capability, a European alternative to the Tomahawk. It is, in concept, exactly what NATO's eastern flank needs. Ground-launched, long-range, precise, and independent of American political weather. The problem, as anyone who has watched European defense procurement over the past 3 decades will immediately recognize, is that ELSA exists today primarily as an ambition. The most optimistic timeline puts it at operational readiness sometime in the 2030s. And the history of Franco-German defense cooperation, the fighter jet program that stalled for years over competing national requirements, the infantry vehicle programs that got tangled in industrial politics, does not inspire absolute confidence that ambition will translate smoothly into capability. But here is what I want you to understand about how serious people think about stopgaps in high-stakes environments. When you are a special operations commander and your primary asset is unavailable, you do not sit down and wait for the perfect solution to arrive. You assess what you have, you assess what your partner forces have, you identify the best available bridge between your current position and your required end state, and you execute. Imperfectly, perhaps, with risk, certainly, but you move. Because waiting for perfect is the strategy of people who have never had to operate without it. And that is exactly the conversation now beginning around Ukraine's own long-range strike capabilities as a potential stopgap for Europe's missile deficit. Ukraine has spent 4 years developing, under wartime conditions, with wartime urgency, the kind of long-range drone and strike technology that most NATO nations have spent 4 decades theorizing about in research institutions. Ukraine's defense technology arm, Brave One, announced this week the deployment readiness of its first domestically produced glide bombs, 250-kilogram warheads capable of striking targets dozens of kilometers behind enemy lines, developed in 17 months. 17 months from concept to combat deployment in the middle of a war. That is not a procurement story. That is a testament to what human ingenuity produces when the alternative is national extinction. Now think about what it means if that capability, that Ukrainian capacity for rapid, cost-effective, operationally proven weapons development becomes part of the equation for filling Europe's long-range fires gap. Think about what it means for the strategic relationship between Ukraine and the European nations that have been supporting it. The dynamic shifts. Ukraine is no longer only the recipient of Western military assistance. Ukraine becomes a defense industrial partner, a source of battlefield-tested technology, a country whose engineers have been solving under live fire the exact problems that European defense firms are just beginning to seriously model. That is a transformation in the strategic relationship that has implications far beyond this war. And it connects directly to something that France and Ukraine are already discussing, a collaborative ballistic missile defense system. President Zelensky announced it publicly after a phone call with Emmanuel Macron. He is building what he calls an international anti-ballistic coalition. And if you think that is simply a military hardware conversation, you are missing the deeper architecture being constructed here. Zelensky is doing what every great strategic leader does when faced with asymmetric odds. He is building a coalition not just of arms and ammunition, but of interest, of commitment, of shared stakes. He is making European security and Ukrainian survival into the same equation. Because if they are the same equation, then European nations are not donors to Ukraine's defense. They are investors in their own. I have watched leaders operate under pressure my entire career. I have seen what separates the ones who navigate crisis from the ones who are consumed by it. And one of the most consistent markers of genuine strategic leadership is the ability to convert adversity into leverage, to look at a situation that appears to be purely a liability and find within it an asset. Zelensky has done this repeatedly throughout this war, and he is doing it again now, not just with diplomacy and military operations, but with the human dimension of the conflict, which may ultimately be the most decisive dimension of all. Because while the drones were flying over Moscow and the diplomatic cables were humming between Kyiv and Paris and Berlin, the Ukrainian government was simultaneously wrestling with the question that will define the war's next chapter. How do you sustain a volunteer military culture inside a society that has been at war for over 12 years? How do you ask people, real people, with families and fears and exhaustion and grief, to keep stepping forward when the end is not yet visible? The answer Ukraine is building is not a simple one. It is a system, a recruitment architecture that operates at the brigade level, allowing potential soldiers to choose not just a branch of service, but a specific unit, a specific commander, a specific community of warriors they will live and fight alongside. The research supporting this approach is not academic. It comes from direct sociological surveys conducted in the field, in real time, with people who are actually making the decision about whether to enlist. And what those surveys found is both deeply human and strategically critical. The factor that matters most to potential recruits is not the salary, not the equipment, not the political cause, though all of those matter. What matters most is the commander, the human being who will be responsible for their life from the moment they sign their name, the person in whose judgment and character they are being asked to place their trust absolutely. Think about what that tells you about leadership. Not about management, not about organizational theory, not about command structures on a slide deck, about leadership, the real kind, the kind that exists in the space between a commander and the people who follow them into places where people die. That relationship, that bond of trust and accountability, is not manufactured by a recruiting poster or a social media campaign or a signing bonus. It is earned. It is built over time through demonstrated competence, through moral courage, through the thousand small moments when a leader either rises to the standard or falls short of it. And the fact that Ukrainian recruits are choosing their units based on their assessment of that relationship tells you that even in the middle of the most brutal war in Europe since 1945, human beings are still making fundamentally human decisions. And then there is the question of women. 75,000 women are currently serving in Ukraine's armed forces, every single one of them a volunteer. Every single one of them having made a choice that no law required of them in a society that spent decades telling them that certain roles were not available to them, that certain risks were not theirs to take. They are serving as drone operators, as unit commanders, as intelligence analysts, as combat medics operating under fire. They are filling positions that the Soviet-era military code said they could not occupy. And they are doing it because the nature of modern warfare has shifted in ways that render the old physical hierarchies increasingly irrelevant. I want to dwell on this for a moment because it matters beyond the specific context of Ukraine. The integration of women into combat roles is not a social experiment. It is a strategic imperative for any military that wants to maximize its available talent pool in an era when cognitive capability, technical precision, and systems thinking are as militarily decisive as physical endurance. Ukraine has discovered this not in a think tank, but on the battlefield. The evidence is not theoretical, it is operational. Women are commanding drone units. Women are holding the line in positions that would have been closed to them by regulation just a decade ago. And the cultural resistance, the well-meaning but ultimately limiting instinct of male commanders to protect women from danger is being overcome not by mandate, but by demonstrated performance. That is how culture actually changes, not by decree, by proof. But here's the dimension of this conflict that I want to leave you thinking about most carefully, because it operates below the surface of the battlefield in ways that are invisible until suddenly they are not. The information war. The disinformation campaign that Russia is running against Ukrainian society is not a supplement to its military campaign. It is an integral component of it, and it is evolving with a sophistication and a technological acceleration that should concern every democracy on the planet, not just Ukraine. The Ukrainian Security and Cooperation Center has been tracking this campaign in real time. 10 million mentions across social media platforms, analyzed over 6 months, focused on 3 topics: mobilization, conscription, and social unity. Of those 10 million mentions, 7.5 million were negative narratives about Ukraine's conscription system. 7.5 million. And the campaign is not static, it is adaptive. Russia observed that negative sentiment toward conscription officers was building, and it deliberately amplified that sentiment, pushed it toward escalation, and began seeding content designed to provoke actual physical violence against Ukrainian military recruiters on the streets of Ukrainian cities. And it worked. Cases of physical confrontations have increased. The language of Russian propaganda has entered the vocabulary of Ukrainian civilians who have no idea they are repeating Kremlin talking points. And now Russia is doing it with artificial intelligence at a scale and quality that was not possible 2 years ago. AI-generated videos of soldiers who look Ukrainian, who wear Ukrainian uniforms, who speak with Ukrainian accents, delivering messages designed to demoralize, to encourage surrender, to undermine trust in command. The production quality is high enough that ordinary people cannot immediately identify it as synthetic. And these videos are being deployed through Telegram, a platform that is Russian-made and Russian-operated, directly into the information ecosystem of Ukrainian society. Here is what I need you to understand about information warfare, because this is not a Ukrainian problem. This is a problem for every open society, every democracy, every nation whose citizens consume information through digital platforms that can be weaponized by adversarial state actors. The goal of this kind of campaign is not to convince people of a specific lie. The goal is to corrode trust itself, to make people uncertain about what is real, skeptical of what they are told, exhausted by the effort of discernment. A population that cannot agree on basic facts cannot sustain a coherent political will, and a nation without coherent political will cannot sustain a war. That is the strategic logic. It is elegant, it is patient, and it is working at scale in ways that most Western nations are not yet taking seriously enough. Alicia Oronova, one of the sharpest analytical minds working on this problem in Kyiv, made a point that I want you to carry with you long after this briefing ends. She said that Ukrainian society is adapting, that people are moving from needing specific facts debunked to developing a more systemic understanding of how disinformation operates. That is exactly the right direction. Because the answer to information warfare is not just better fact-checking. It is cognitive resilience. It is a population trained to ask not just, is this true, but who benefits from me believing this? And how did this reach me? That is a skill that must be taught, practiced, and maintained, like any other combat skill, like physical fitness, like weapons proficiency, like tactical decision-making under stress. And this brings me to the final lesson, the one that connects everything we have discussed today, from the burning runways of Moscow to the factory floors of Oberndorf, from the drone operators of Kyiv to the policy architects in Brussels, from the runners who kept moving through an air raid alert to the women who keep volunteering for a war that has never demanded they do so. Resilience is not an emotion. It is not something you feel when circumstances are favorable. It is a discipline. It is a decision made before the crisis arrives, maintained through the crisis, and sustained after the crisis passes. The nations and the people who are navigating this moment most effectively are not the ones who were lucky enough to avoid hard choices. They are the ones who made hard choices before the hard choices became unavoidable. Germany is rearming now because it finally accepted that the assumption of permanent peace was a fantasy. Ukraine is building a volunteer recruitment culture now because it understood that compulsion alone cannot sustain a military that needs not just bodies, but committed warriors. Europe is racing to develop indigenous long-range strike capability now because it finally accepted that strategic dependence on a single ally is not a strategy, it is a bet, and bets can be lost. Every lesson that is being learned in real time at enormous cost on the battlefields of Ukraine and in the ministries of European capitals is a lesson that could have been learned earlier. That is always true of the hardest lessons. They are available in advance. The question is whether we are willing to pay the lower price of learning them before the crisis, or whether we wait until the crisis forces the lesson upon us at a price we can barely afford.